I'm Catherine Vittori, and I'm here today with Tim Franken, Mallory Szynski, and Chase Woods, and we're going to talk about our project on Microsoft Company's stock value. Today our project will touch on our business's analytic framing, business problem, data, methodology, model, conclusion, and we will sign off by talking about our model's weaknesses. The business problem that our group set out to solve is whether or not Microsoft Company's stock is undervalued or overvalued. This problem is important to us because it will tell us whether or not we should invest in Microsoft's stock.
In order to solve our business problem, we will look at Microsoft returns and the S&P 500 returns. From that, we will find Microsoft's optimal equity beta using the regression analysis. From our equity beta, we will solve for the market risk and the risk-free rate. With those numbers, we will use the CAPM formula to find the Microsoft's cost of equity and then use Microsoft's annualized actual return. And then we will compare the cost of equity to the annualized actual return.
For this project, we had to make a couple assumptions. The first assumption we made was we assumed that 3 time periods for the return numbers, finding the optimal equity beta. Secondly, we assumed that the 5-year monthly return data gives us our optimal equity beta. Our third assumption is that the CAPM has to have 2 different risk-free rates, one being an annual average and the other coming from 10-year treasury rates.
The data file our group used consisted of 10 Excel sheets. The first sheet was Microsoft returns that we used as our X variable in our regression. The second sheet was S&P 500 returns that we used as our Y variable in our regression. The third through fifth sheet was running our 3 periods of regressions, being 2-year weekly, 3-year weekly, and 5-year monthly. The 5-year monthly return will give us our optimal equity beta. And then we move on to the 6th sheet, which is finding our average market risk. The average market risk is important to put in our CAPM formula for finding our cost of equity. The 7th sheet is finding our average risk-free rate. That is also important to find for our CAPM formula for finding our cost of equity. And then we move on to our 8th sheet, which is formulating the CAPM so that we can find our cost of equity. Sheet 9 is finding Microsoft's actual return, which is important for finding our final answer. And sheet 10 is our final evaluation, which is where we get our answer from comparing the cost of equity and Microsoft's actual returns.
For this project, we used 3 historical data sites. The first was Yahoo Finance, the second was Federal Reserve H15 website, and the third was the Treasury Yield website. These links can be found below.
The methodology we decided to use is estimating risk and cost of equity approach. This approach uses 8 steps to solve our business problem and works best for this project because of the regression analysis that it uses. We decided to rule out the weighted average cost of capital approach. We ruled out this approach because it does not use a regression analysis, which does not coincide with this project. And lastly, the model is more time-consuming than the estimating risk and cost of capital approach. The model we chose to use was comparing the Microsoft cost of equity and their actual return to value their stock. This model uses regression to find an optimal equity beta. Within that regression, the Y variable is S&P 500 returns as the proxy. The X variable is Microsoft's returns. Within these regressions, we use the coefficient category to find our beta. And then once we have our optimal equity beta, we will calculate the cost of equity from the CAPM formula. Moving on, we calculate actual return of Microsoft. And then finally, we compare the cost of equity and the actual return to get our final answer. We considered using the WACC approach to compare a calculated stock price to an original stock price. We ruled out this method because this approach does not use a regression. It also requires more assumptions to be made, and it has more steps involved to get to a final answer. In conclusion, our evaluation of Microsoft led us to get a cost of equity that was 7.51% and an actual return that's 29.13%. from those since the cost of equity is less than the actual return, we can conclude that Microsoft stock is undervalued, which means that it is a good investment currently.
Something else to consider in our conclusion is that if our analysis led us to get a cost of equity percentage that was greater than actual return percentage, we would have concluded that Microsoft is overvalued and not a good investment. This alternative is important to understand because it shows both sides of how this approach works when valuing a company's stock. Our conclusion has led us to believe that Microsoft's cost of equity is less than the actual return, so we believe that it would be undervalued and therefore a good investment. An alternative conclusion to note is that if the cost of equity was greater than the actual return, the company would be overvalued and therefore not a wise investment.
We decided to note 2 weaknesses within our model. The first one being that our model is not as accurate as other possible models, and this is because our final valuation is based upon comparing 2 percentages. If we were to have used the WACC model, this still compares 2 numbers, but this is more accurate because of how detailed the valuation is. Our second weakness is that our model's equity beta could become more accurate if we had used longer time periods. This does not matter as much, but it is still important to point out how beta would have changed based on our sample period, whether it was longer or shorter.